Warning: this video contains content about real-life serial killers that may be disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Within the shadowy depths of American crime lurk those driven by twisted desires and insatiable bloodlust. Join us as we explore the chilling tales of the nation's most notorious serial killers. These are the top 20 serial killers in America. Number 20. Ed Gein. Ed Gein, a notorious serial killer, committed his crimes in Plainfield, Wisconsin during the 1950s. Gein's twisted acts primarily involved two women, Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, whose bodies he mutilated and used for various purposes. Gein's methods were particularly gruesome, involving both murder and grave robbing. He reportedly murdered Hogan with a shotgun blast to the head and Worden by shooting her in the store she owned. Gein's macabre acts extended beyond murder. He often dug up corpses from local graveyards and fashioned trophies and household items from their remains. Gein was arrested in 1957 at the age of 51 when authorities discovered Worden's body in his house, leading to a search that uncovered the full extent of his horrors. He was found guilty, but declared legally insane, spending the rest of his life in a mental institution. Though Gein's body count was relatively low, his crimes shocked the nation and left a lasting legacy in popular culture. Number 19. H.H. Holmes. H.H. Holmes, born Herman Webster Mudgett, was a notorious serial killer active during the late 19th century. He is believed to have murdered at least 9 victims, although the exact number is uncertain. Holmes lured his victims, mostly young women, into his hotel in Chicago, which he had specifically designed for his sinister purposes. The building, known as the Murder Castle, contained hidden passages, trapdoors, and soundproof rooms where Holmes would torture and kill his victims. His methods of murder were diverse, including asphyxiation, poisoning, and dismemberment. Holmes would often dissect the bodies and sell the organs or skeletons to medical schools. Holmes was finally apprehended in 1894 at the age of 34 after the disappearance of his accomplice. Benjamin Pitezel raised suspicions. He was arrested in Boston and later tried and convicted for the murder of Pitezel. Holmes was sentenced to death and executed by hanging in 1896. His crimes and the elaborate nature of the Murder Castle have cemented his place in history as one of America's most infamous serial killers. Number 18. David Parker Ray. David Parker Ray, also known as the Toy Box Killer, was a serial killer and suspected serial rapist who operated in New Mexico during the 1990s. Ray's crimes were characterized by extreme sadism and sexual torture. He targeted women whom he would abduct and take to a soundproof trailer he referred to as his toy box. Once inside, Ray would subject his victims to horrific acts of sexual abuse, torture, and degradation, often while playing recorded audio tapes detailing the torture procedures and warning his victims of the consequences of attempting to escape. Ray's exact number of victims is uncertain, but he is believed to have abducted and tortured numerous women over the years. Some of his victims were believed to have died from the abuse, while others were released or managed to escape. Ray's crimes took place primarily in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, where he lived and operated his trailer. Ray was finally arrested in 1999 at the age of 59 after one of his intended victims managed to escape and alert the authorities. Police discovered evidence of his gruesome crimes, including the toy box trailer and numerous items used in the torture and sexual abuse of his victims. Ray was convicted of multiple counts of kidnapping and sexual torture and sentenced to over 200 years in prison. He died of a heart attack in 2002 at the age of 62 while incarcerated. Number 17. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos was a serial killer who murdered 7 men in Florida between 1989 and 1990. Wuornos targeted her victims while working as a prostitute, luring them with the promise of sexual services before shooting them at point-blank range with a .22 caliber pistol. Her killings were characterized by a mix of robbery, self-defense claims, and potentially motives of revenge against men. Wuornos' crimes occurred along highways and in secluded areas throughout Florida. She would often dispose of the bodies in wooded areas or along remote roadsides. Wuornos was arrested in 1991 at the age of 35 after leaving fingerprints and other evidence at one of the crime scenes. During her trial, she confessed to the murders, but claimed they were acts of self-defense against men who had assaulted or threatened her. Despite her claims, Wuornos was convicted and sentenced to death. She was executed by lethal injection in 2002 at the age of 46. Number 16. David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam, terrorized New York City during the summer of 1976 and 1977. Berkowitz targeted young women and couples, shooting them with a .44 caliber revolver. His killings were characterized by surprise attacks in dark, secluded areas. Berkowitz's victims often had little chance to defend themselves against his sudden and lethal assaults. In total, Berkowitz murdered 6 people and wounded several others. His crimes primarily occurred in the boroughs of the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn. Berkowitz's reign of terror came to an end in August 1977 when he was arrested by police after a lengthy investigation. He was 24 years old at the time of his arrest. Berkowitz confessed to the shootings and was sentenced to life in prison for each murder he committed. Number 15. Rodney Alcala. Rodney Alcala, also known as the dating game killer, was a serial killer and rapist who operated in California during the 1970s. Alcala's crimes involved luring young women and girls, often through his charm and photography hobby, before sexually assaulting and murdering them. Alcala's methods of murder varied, but he often strangled his victims to death or bludgeoned them with objects. He would then often pose their bodies in sexually suggestive positions and sometimes took photographs of them as trophies. Alcala's exact number of victims is unknown, but he has been convicted of at least 5 murders. His crimes occurred in various locations across Southern California, including Los Angeles, Orange County, and Marin County. Alcala was arrested multiple times throughout the 1970s for various offenses, including assault and kidnapping, but managed to evade serious consequences. However, he was finally arrested in 1979 at the age of 36 after a witness recognized him and reported him to the police. He was initially convicted of the murder of a 12-year-old girl, but later linked to additional murders through DNA evidence. Alcala was sentenced to death in 1980, but his conviction was overturned twice. He was eventually sentenced to death a 3rd time in 2010 at the age of 66 for the murders of 5 young women in the 1970s. He died of natural causes while on death row in 2021. Number 14. Keith Hunter Jesperson. Keith Hunter Jesperson, dubbed the Happy Face Killer, was a serial murderer who terrorized the United States in the early 1990s. He confessed to killing 8 women across multiple states. Jesperson's victims were often strangers whom he targeted while working as a long-haul truck driver. He would gain their trust, then strangle them to death using his hands or other ligatures. The murders took place in various locations, including Oregon, Washington, Wyoming, and California. Jesperson's crimes were characterized by their brutality and his lack of remorse. Despite his attempts to avoid detection by moving across state lines, Jesperson was eventually arrested in 1995 at the age of 40 after confessing to his crimes to his brother, who then went to the police. Jesperson was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His arrest and subsequent incarceration brought an end to his reign of terror and provided closure to the families of his victims. Number 13. Paul John Knowles. Paul John Knowles, also known as the Casanova Killer and the Casanova Strangler, was a serial killer active during the 1970s. Knowles targeted victims across the United States, committing a string of murders characterized by their brutality. His victims included men, women, and children, and he often used a variety of methods to kill them, including strangulation, stabbing, and bludgeoning. Knowles would frequently change his appearance and identity to evade capture, making it difficult for law enforcement to track him down. He would often befriend his victims before brutally attacking and killing them, sometimes stealing their belongings or vehicles afterward. The exact number of Knowles' victims is uncertain, but he is believed to have killed at least 18 people. His crimes spanned multiple states, including Florida, Georgia, and California. Knowles was eventually arrested in November 1974 at the age of 28 after a high-speed chase with law enforcement in Georgia. During his arrest, Knowles confessed to multiple murders and provided details about his crimes. He was subsequently convicted of several murders and sentenced to death. However, Knowles was shot and killed by a sheriff's deputy while attempting to escape from custody in 1974 at the age of 28, bringing an end to his reign of terror. Number 12, John Joubert. John Joubert was a serial killer who operated in Nebraska and Maine during the 1980s. He targeted young boys, brutally murdering them with a knife. Joubert's killings were characterized by extreme violence, including stabbing his victims multiple times. His first known victim was 11-year-old Ricky Stetson in Nebraska, followed by 13-year-old Danny Joe Eberle and another boy, Christopher Walden, in Maine. Joubert was apprehended in 1983 at the age of 20 after being linked to the murders through eyewitness accounts and forensic evidence. He was found guilty of the murders and subsequently sentenced to death. Joubert's arrest and conviction brought an end to his reign of terror, but his crimes left a lasting impact on the communities where he struck. Number 11, Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader, also known as the BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill Killer, murdered 10 people between 1974 and 1991 in Wichita, Kansas. Rader's modus operandi involved stalking and then binding, torturing, and killing his victims, often using ligatures. He would sometimes engage in acts of necrophilia with the bodies before disposing of them. Rader's crimes took place in various locations around Wichita, including the homes of his victims. He would often target individuals or families, gaining access to their homes under false pretenses before carrying out his gruesome acts. Despite a lengthy investigation, Rader remained elusive for decades. However, he resurfaced in 2004 when he began communicating with the media and authorities, eventually leading to his arrest at the age of 59. His arrest came after he sent a floppy disk to the police, which contained metadata linking it to a computer at his church. Rader was subsequently convicted of his crimes and sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Number 10, Wayne Williams. Wayne Williams was a suspect in the Atlanta child murders, a series of killings that occurred between 1979 and 1981 in Atlanta, Georgia. Williams was convicted of 2 adult murders, but was believed to be responsible for more, including the deaths of several children. The victims, primarily African-American boys, were strangled or asphyxiated, with their bodies often dumped in rivers or other remote areas. The crimes took place in Atlanta and the surrounding areas, causing widespread fear and panic in the community, particularly among African-American families. Williams was arrested in 1981 at the age of 23 after being linked to the murders through fiber evidence found on the victims' bodies and in his home. Although he maintained his innocence, Williams was convicted of the murders of 2 adults and sentenced to life in prison. Despite suspicions surrounding his involvement in the child murders, he was never formally charged or convicted for those crimes. Number 9, Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper, also known as the co-ed killer, murdered 10 people, including his grandparents, mother, and 6 young women in California during the 1960s and 1970s. Kemper's killings were characterized by extreme violence, including strangulation, stabbing, and dismemberment. He often targeted hitchhiking college students or young women whom he would pick up and then take to secluded areas, where he would carry out his gruesome acts. The murders took place in various locations around California, including Santa Cruz and Alameda County. Kemper's crimes shocked the nation and instilled fear in the community, as he was known for his large stature and seemingly calm demeanor. Kemper was eventually arrested in 1973 at the age of 24 after he called the police and confessed to his crimes. He was subsequently convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Despite his horrific acts, Kemper has since become a subject of fascination for criminal psychologists and the public alike due to his intelligence and articulate nature. Number 8. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, famously known as the Night Stalker, terrorized California during the mid-1980s with a series of brutal murders, sexual assaults, and burglaries. Ramirez targeted individuals of varying ages and demographics, breaking into their homes during the night. His modus operandi involved using firearms, knives, or blunt objects to kill his victims, often leaving behind gruesome scenes of violence. Ramirez's crimes spanned multiple locations across Southern California, including Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Orange County. He would often select his victims at random, instilling fear and panic within the community. Ramirez was finally apprehended in August 1985 at the age of 25 after a group of citizens recognized him and pursued him until police arrived. He was charged with 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. Ramirez was ultimately convicted and sentenced to death, though he died in prison from complications related to B-cell lymphoma in 2013. Number 7. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, responsible for the murders of at least 30 young women during the 1970s. Bundy's modus operandi involved luring his victims, often college-aged women, by feigning injury or authority, or by pretending to need assistance. Once he gained their trust, he would overpower and assault them, sometimes using weapons like crowbars or tire irons. Bundy's victims were typically raped, strangled, and bludgeoned to death. The murders occurred in various locations across the United States, including Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. Bundy's crimes were characterized by their brutality and his ability to evade capture for an extended period. Bundy was arrested in 1975 at the age of 28 for a traffic violation, but was later linked to multiple murders through eyewitness testimony and physical evidence. He was convicted of several murders in separate trials and sentenced to death. Bundy was executed in the electric chair in Florida in 1989 at the age of 42, leaving behind a legacy of terror and fascination with his charismatic facade and gruesome crimes. Number 6. Joseph Edward Duncan. Joseph Edward Duncan was a serial killer and child predator who committed a series of heinous crimes in multiple states during the early 2000s. Duncan's most notorious acts involved the kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder of several young children. His modus operandi often included stalking families, breaking into their homes, and abducting their children. On April 4, 1997, 10-year-old Anthony Martinez was playing with his friends in the front yard of his home when Duncan grabbed him at knife point and threw him into his vehicle. The boy's body was found 2 weeks later, nude and partially decomposed. Investigators noted that he had been sexually assaulted and bound with duct tape. One of Duncan's most infamous crimes occurred in 2005 when he kidnapped Dylan and Shasta Groen from their home in Idaho after murdering their older brother, mother, and her boyfriend. Duncan subjected the children to weeks of horrifying abuse before ultimately killing Dylan and later being captured by law enforcement with Shasta rescued alive. Shasta told investigators that Duncan had confessed to additional crimes, including the murder of 11-year-old Samiejo White and her 9-year-old half-sister Carmen Cubillas in 1996. Their skeletal remains were found on February 10, 1998. Duncan admitted to beating them to death. Duncan's crimes spanned multiple states, including Idaho, California, and Washington. He was arrested in July 2005 in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, at the age of 42 after a nationwide manhunt. Duncan was subsequently convicted of multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. He was sentenced to death and ultimately died in prison in 2021. Number 5. Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, was a prolific serial killer who operated in the Pacific Northwest, primarily in Washington state, during the 1980s and 1990s. Ridgway's victims were primarily young women, many of whom were sex workers or runaways. He would pick them up along the Pacific Highway South, strangle them to death, and then dump their bodies in remote wooded areas or along the Green River. Ridgway's method of murder was typically manual strangulation, although he also admitted to using ligatures on occasion. He often returned to the dump sites to have sexual intercourse with the victims' bodies. Ridgway's exact number of victims remains uncertain, but he confessed to the murders of 49 women. His crimes caused fear and panic in the Seattle area as bodies continued to be discovered over the span of several years. Despite being a suspect early in the investigation, Ridgway avoided arrest for nearly 2 decades. He was finally apprehended in 2001 at the age of 52, thanks to advancements in DNA technology that linked him to the crimes. Ridgway ultimately pleaded guilty to 48 counts of murder in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His cooperation led to the closure of many unsolved cases, bringing a sense of closure to the victims' families and communities. Number 4. William Bonin. William Bonin, also known as the Freeway Killer, was a serial killer who terrorized Southern California during the late 1970s. Bonin's victims were teenage boys and young men whom he would lure into his vehicle with the promise of giving them a ride. Once inside, he would torture, sexually assault, and murder them. Bonin's methods of murder were brutal, often involving strangulation or asphyxiation with ligatures, such as shoelaces or cords. He would then discard the bodies along freeways or remote areas. Bonin's crimes primarily occurred in Los Angeles and Orange County. He was arrested in 1980 at the age of 33 after one of his accomplices, Vernon Butts, provided information to the police. Butts confessed to his involvement in the murders and implicated Bonin as the ringleader. Bonin was subsequently convicted of 14 murders, but is suspected of being responsible for more. He was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection in 1996 at the age of 49. Number 3. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, known as the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster, committed a series of horrific murders between 1978 and 1991. Dahmer's victims were primarily young men whom he lured to his apartment under the guise of offering them alcohol or money in exchange for sexual favors. Once inside, Dahmer would drug his victims before strangling them to death. After killing his victims, Dahmer engaged in acts of necrophilia, dismemberment, and cannibalism. He preserved body parts and kept souvenirs from his victims as trophies. Dahmer's crimes took place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he lived alone in an apartment. Dahmer's reign of terror ended in 1991 when one of his intended victims managed to escape and alerted the police. When authorities arrived at Dahmer's apartment, they discovered evidence of his gruesome crimes, including human remains and photographs. Dahmer was arrested at the age of 31 and ultimately confessed to the murders of 17 young men. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, but was later beaten to death by a fellow inmate in 1994 at the age of 34. Number 2. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr., also known as the Kansas City Butcher, committed a series of gruesome murders in Kansas City, Missouri during the 1980s. Berdella targeted young men whom he lured to his home under the guise of friendship or employment. Once inside, he subjected his victims to prolonged periods of torture, including sexual assault, mutilation, and drugging. Berdella's methods of murder varied, but they often involved strangulation or overdoses of drugs. He kept his victims alive for days or even weeks, subjecting them to unimaginable horrors before ultimately killing them. Berdella's crimes took place at his home on Charlotte Street in Kansas City. He was arrested in 1988 at the age of 39 after one of his victims managed to escape and alert authorities. Police discovered evidence of Berdella's gruesome crimes, including human remains and torture devices, leading to his arrest and subsequent confession. Berdella was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 1. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, was a notorious serial killer who preyed on young men and boys in the Chicago area during the 1970s. Gacy's modus operandi involved luring his victims to his home under the pretense of offering them work or money, often promising them construction jobs. Once inside his house, Gacy would overpower his victims, often by handcuffing or strangling them before sexually assaulting and murdering them. After killing his victims, Gacy would bury their bodies in the crawl space beneath his house or discard them in nearby rivers. Some victims were found with evidence of torture and abuse. In total, Gacy was convicted of killing 33 young men and boys. His crimes occurred primarily in Cook County, Illinois, particularly in the Chicago suburbs. Gacy was arrested in December 1978 at the age of 36 after a surveillance operation and subsequent investigation linked him to the disappearance of several young men. Police discovered human remains buried on his property, leading to his arrest and eventual conviction. Gacy was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection in 1994 at the age of 52. His case remains one of the most chilling and disturbing in American criminal history. Each of these individuals left a mark of terror and tragedy in their wake, reminding us of the capacity for evil that exists in the world. What's your reaction to this countdown? Which case shocked you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to leave a like if you found this countdown intriguing, and subscribe for more fascinating content on true crime, mysteries, and beyond.